I mowed the lawn on Friday. I was trying to think as I went of the number of lawns that I've mowed in my day, the number of backyards and front yards that I've combed with my feet, the number of maple trees and oak trees and sycamore trees and cedar trees that I've high-fived on my way by, back and forth, back and forth. Mowing the lawn, especially with a push mower, is an intimate process. It's a good way to get to know a place. Walking back and forth around obstacles, touching base with the trees along the way. There's a way in which this is how the story of Abraham reads. Remember that guy? When we meet him here at the beginning of his story, his name is Abram. And Abram means exalted father. Later in the stories, God changes his name to Abraham, which means father of multitudes. Because God tells Abram that he will become the father of multitudes and that he will have a place, a land to call his own. So Abram sets out on a long walk, back and forth, around obstacles, touching base with a couple of name-worthy oak trees along the way, all to get to know this promised land that is new to him. I'm going to do 3 things here for us. 1, we're going to get oriented to just where we are in the overall flow of the Hebrew Bible. And 2, I'm going to summarize the chapters in Genesis that tell Abraham's story, and I'm going to summarize them far too fast, hopefully in a way that'll entice you to crack the stories open and give them a closer look yourself. And 3, I'm going to offer 3 life lessons that we can take away from the legends of Abraham. At this point on our journey through Genesis, we cross a threshold. Up until now, in this series that we've been in, what we have been in is mythic time. There are the myths of creation, of Genesis 1 and 2, where we meet the spirit of creation bubbling over with delight. And then our mythical ancestors, Adam and Eve, and their expulsion from Eden after an encounter with a talkative snake and an infamous fruit tree. Then their sons, Cain and Abel, who are somehow born into an already populated world. Mythic time can do things like that. This world that's established with things like conflict and competition and violence. By the time Noah comes on the stage, that violence has gotten out of hand, and Genesis tells us of a flood that was already a well-known myth in the ancient Near East. And there's the story of the Tower of Babel that we looked at last week, an etiology for the many cultures and languages in the world, while also serving as a subversive corrective to imperial power. These mythic tales carry us through the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And then we're introduced to Abram, who will become Abraham. And with this introduction, we move from mythic time into legendary time, more historical time. Myths are sacred, symbolic stories that explain the origins of things and that often explore deep spiritual truths. Myths are often deeply true in that sense. Legends are traditional tales that are to various extents rooted in real history. Mind you, not biographical or journalistic reporting. Rather, they tell of the exaggerated and larger-than-life deeds of real human beings. That's what we've got when Abraham enters the scene. Whereas the stories of the myths in the first chunk of Genesis happen in a time outside of time, now we step into the telling of legends that can be mapped out, not with absolute precision, but with some degree of accuracy on a timeline of history. Father Abraham, a larger-than-life figure. He's a wanderer, an adventurer, longing for a place to land. He is the consummate immigrant. a wholehearted follower of his particular God, a partner friend of God, a family man, a protector of kin, one who honors his father and nevertheless sets off on his own path. He is a father of many in his own right, and one who sends them off on their own. Deceptive at times, courageous at times, often deferential to the demands of others, namely God and his wife, not necessarily in that order. Even so, he often speaks his mind. He almost always moves decisively, a man not only of belief but of active faith. He worships in the shade of trees and practices bloody rituals of covenant. We have about 13 chapters worth of legendary tales about Abraham, moving back and forth on the land that God promised him. Here's my flyover summary. In chapter 12, Abram differentiates from his father and sets off, heeding God's blessing and call by way of the oak of Moreh. He flees to Egypt to feed his family during a famine and lies about Sarai being his sister, not his wife. And he gets rich. Then in chapter 13, Abram gives his nephew Lot a choice of land, and Abram settles the less fertile plot by the oaks of Mamre. Chapter 14, Abram rescues Lot and encounters Melchizedek. Stay tuned for more on Melchizedek next week. In chapter 15, Abram cuts animals in half to make a covenant, berit, with God, and he dreams of the smoking fire pot and torch. More about that whole affair below. In chapter 16, Abram has Ishmael with Hagar. Chapter 17, Abram, the exalted father, gets a name change to Abraham, the father of multitudes, and he doubles down on his confidence in God's covenant with the practice of ritual circumcision. Chapter 18, Abraham entertains God as a house guest by the oaks of Mamre and intercedes for Lot. Chapter 19 is an interlude about his nephew and about Sodom and Gomorrah. In chapter 20, Abraham lies again about Sarah, who at this point also has a new name. Chapter 21, Abraham and Sarah have Isaac, and they send Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness. In chapter 22, Abraham is called to bind a kedah and sacrifice Isaac. Spoiler, he doesn't go through with it. A ram saves the day. Chapter 23, Abraham buys a burial plot for Sarah. Chapter 24, Abraham sends for a wife for Isaac from his homeland. In chapter 25, Abraham remarries and has more children with his wife Keturah. He doles out gifts to his children. He privileges Isaac. He dies happy. So, what might we take away from Abraham's life and legacy? Aside from, the three of the most influential religious traditions that have shaped the world and history and geopolitical relations to this day. Here are 3 life principles from the legends of Abraham. First, faithfulness is a long walk. There's a misconception that goes something like this: if I'm truly living with faith, then I will not have doubts, and I will not experience uncertainty or confusion. But that simply is not the case. A life of good faith is a process of consistently demonstrating the audacity to forge ahead precisely in the presence of the unknown. A life of good faith is a long and varied walk, and it's never in a straight line. It's full of obstacles and the uncertainty of promises that seem like impossibilities. So, if you have encountered some obstacles along the way, if you've turned this way and that, if you found yourself arguing with God, disagreeing with God, wondering about why it is that you are even aiming your life toward faithfulness, well, you're in good company. You're probably heading in the right direction. Keep on going. The second principle from the legends of Abraham God's promises invite us to make decisions, and our decisions give shape to God's promises. God's promises invite us to make decisions, and our decisions give shape to God's promises. One of the most prevalent themes throughout the Bible is the theme of covenant. Covenant with God in the legends of Abraham is an active thing. The Hebrew word for covenant is berit, the root of which implies cutting. There are two covenant rituals that Abraham engages. One is the ritual of circumcision, which is a cutting off of a not insignificant part of oneself. And two, the second, is an interesting part of Abraham's story in chapter 15. It goes like this. Abram said, God, how am I to know this, that you will follow through on your promises? And God said, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, and a dove, and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these animals to God, split them down the middle, and laid the halves opposite each other. As the sun went down, a deep sleep overcame Abram. When the sun was down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch moved between the split carcasses. That's when God made a covenant with Abram. This is an odd story to us, but not out of the ordinary for those doing business in the ancient Near East. This was how people made deals, literally cut a deal. The parties of the covenant that was being made would walk between the parts of the animals like a threshold of mutual agreement, saying essentially, if I don't follow through, may I become like these animals. It was grisly, but effective. We could look at this and determine covenant requires blood and sacrifice, and there might be something interesting to theologically unpack, explore, and critique about that. But as I reflected on this idea of covenant this week, I wondered, what is it exactly that we are invited to cut when we engage with the life that God promises is possible, the good life, the life of legacy and blessing? The answer is, I am not sure, because there is no universal answer to where you should follow the path of God's promise. Your particular answer is going to look different from mine, and your answer on Thursday might look different from your answer on Tuesday. But generally speaking, God's promises will continually require you to cut off one way of going as you decide on another. The word decision comes from a Latin word that means to cut off. God's promises will lead us again and again to moments of decision. The most tragic thing that we could do at those moments is not making the wrong decision, but making no decision, because it is with our decisions to act that we partner with God's promises. On the long walk of faith, we will, of course, misstep. We will make decisions that are not aligned with God's ways. But on the long walk, we'll also have plenty of opportunities to get better and better at making decisions that do align with the ways, the creative and benevolent ways of God. And that's good news. The third life principle from the legends of Abraham is that blessings are also always callings. At the very beginning of the legends, God tells Abram, I'll make you a great nation and bless you, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Well, there it is, folks. There's the purpose of the whole thing, the motivating reason behind every step on this long walk, the litmus test for every decision we make along the way. We are blessed to be a blessing. We are called to make a contribution to the well-being of others on this earth. So as you go about your days this week, go ahead and hold 2 questions, one in your right hand and one in your left, whenever you engage with others. First, ask, am I striving to do no harm here? Because that's a great place to begin. But don't stop there. Level up to question number 2, which is, in this situation, is there an opportunity for me to actively bless someone to make their life a little bit better? If you look for those opportunities, I promise you'll start to see them everywhere. And I promise, too, that partnering with God in the work of blessing the earth, there's no sweeter way to spend a life.